Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
Among us, Air Vice Marshal Arjun Subramaniam, who is an accomplished fighter pilot from the Indian Air Force, currently embarking on a second career as a military historian, academic, and strategic analyst. He has taught at several universities and the author of India's War, a military history from 1947 to 71. Thank you so much, sir, for your service and secondly for taking your time and being on the show.
Pleasure. It's a pleasure to be, and I'm particularly pleased that a bunch of college students have decided on this initiative, and I think it's a good beginning.
So, firstly, I think this is one of the very first books that has put the vast military history in a chronological order, and I think it was much needed because there was a literature gap that existed, and you have been able to bridge it perfectly.
That, in fact, is the biggest challenge of writing contemporary Indian military history, because the sheer labor that is required to put things together in chronological order actually puts off many military historians, because they wonder whether they would be able to put in the kind of laborious research and be persistent enough to club a whole lot of conflicts together. So yeah, that was one of the main objectives of my book, which was to put everything together under one roof, or at least if not one roof, it's two roofs.
Okay, so my very first and my very obvious question is, what is military history and why is it important to study our wars that took place years back?
Militaries or groups of people who take up arms to protect a state, a group of people, an entity, have been with us for thousands of years. And the role of force, or the use of force to settle disputes, the use of force to expand empires, the use of force to establish nation states, have all been a constant in history. And that is why I felt that one of the gaps in contemporary Indian military history is contemporary Indian history is military history. And that was one of my primary objectives of setting out on this fairly laborious research of mine over 8 years. Because, to put it very simply, to fill in a gap that I felt existed in contemporary Indian historical discourse. And as a result, young people don't get the whole picture when they study or when they read or when they examine the works you can think of.
A lot of books on military history are character-centric in nature, but I believe your book, when I was reading it, I feel it was a little heavy on individual events. Was that a conscious decision?
I wouldn't entirely agree with you, because actually people are at the core of my book, and all my narratives revolve around people. But it just happens to be that events flow around people. Had I just narrated events, it wouldn't have interested anybody, because who is interested in dates, battles, campaigns? This is what happened, that is what happened. You get tired of reading those kind of things. So therefore, unless you have people at the core of any military history narrative, it loses steam halfway through. And that is why people are at the center of my narrative. And it just so happens that the flow is chronological. It so happens that all the important events that have taken place are there in the book. But ultimately, it's a people-centric book, which is why it catches attention of young people like you. For example, you wouldn't have been interested in reading about Siachen until you knew a little bit more about the people who were involved in the Siachen operation. And that is why I've spent a lot of time on describing people, their thoughts, their leadership qualities. So yeah. So people are at the core of my book.
While I was reading the book, I was wondering that you have served in the armed forces, and some of the events that you have spoken about in the book happened while you were serving, and you have spoken to a lot of your colleagues about those events as well. How difficult was it for you to make sure that you put out the story in their voices and yet remain unbiased?
The point is that when I set out to write these books, I said, I will not put on my practitioner's hat when I'm writing the book. When I'm writing the book, I will put on the hat of a historian, I will put on the hat of an academic, and I will put on the hat of a serious researcher who just happens to know many of these people who have actually taken part in the several wars and conflicts. And the second thing that allowed me to retain a large element of objectivity is that though I've personally trained for combat and trained for battle, but I haven't had the opportunity of actually engaging in combat like many of my other colleagues about whom I've written. So that itself allows me to look at things from an outsider insider perspective. I call it an outsider insider perspective. Outsider because I personally haven't been engaged in combat, and insider because I know what it makes or what it involves in making a warrior or making a fighter pilot, or what does it mean being ensconced in a submarine for days together, or what it means flying out of an aircraft carrier, or what it means to belong to the special forces and put yourself in harm's way each and every time that you go into operations. So it was a very judicious mix that has allowed me to retain the objectivity. But mind you, even then, I have had a few critics who say that, look, you have maybe blown out of proportion the exploits of the armed forces. I said, so be it. I'm entitled to some amount of advocacy. Being somebody who served in uniform for the last 38 years, the least I can do is also to engage in some limited amount of judicious advocacy so that more young people like you decide that, look, hey, the armed forces is a good career to go into. Let me also become a soldier, sailor, or an airman. Yeah.
Okay, so if you could also talk about how the armed forces changed over the period of time.
You look at the Tata Group. I mean, say if you ask, say, Ratan Tata, or if you ask somebody who's been with the Tatas for the last 40, 50 years, has the Tata Group changed over time? They will say, of course it has changed. Why is it changed? It's changed because it has had to keep pace with the change in the markets, with the change in consumer behavior, with the change in the business environment. You can attach exactly the same simile to war fighting. And that's how the Indian armed forces have changed over the last 70 years. Initially, you had a preponderance of conventional wars. Then you had the kind of wars changing. You had technology coming in. You had adversaries also, the flavor of our adversaries also changed. And so that's how India's armed forces have had to cope with the changing character of warfare. They've had to cope with technology. And they've had to cope with India's expanding power aspirations. So all these issues have influenced the way in which India's armed forces have grown. So that's why if you recollect, or if you see in my second book, the sequel, I have a full chapter on the changing character of war and how the Indian armed forces have coped with it. Similarly, if you look at my title of the second book, it is Full Spectrum. So when I say full spectrum, I mean to say that, look, India's armed forces have to deal with the full spectrum of conflict.
How has the Indian Armed Forces played an important part in protecting the sovereignty and strengthening the democracy of the country?
Armed forces have played a very, very important role in different facets of Indian democracy. Uh, the, the first thing that comes to a common citizen's mind is that the armed forces are primarily meant to defend a nation state from external threats. And if you look at it, that except for the line of control and for the line of actual control, otherwise the boundaries of India have largely remained unchanged from 1947. Okay, but so the armed forces of India have performed their primary role as per the constitution to the best of its ability, which is to protect Indian sovereignty and to protect India from external adversaries. The second and equally important facet of India's armed forces is that India's armed forces have played a very, very important role in protecting democracy, in ensuring that Indian democracy grows. And you will ask me how. One is India's armed forces have been apolitical, and because they've been apolitical, they have not interfered in the democratic process through ups and downs of Indian democracy. And the second is that whenever Indian democracy has faced internal challenges and what I call internal fissures and cracks in the form of insurgencies, in the form of other secessionist movements, the armed forces have always chipped in, because the armed forces have always been the last bastion or the last resort that the government has called on when the other elements of government have not managed to plug those fissures and cracks. So I think India's armed forces have played a very, very important role in ensuring that the trajectory of Indian democracy has been steady and on an upward trajectory.
I think you've mentioned this in one of the sessions, that the Indian audience that generally mourns the death of American troops in foreign countries is largely unaware of the foreign mission that Indian troops have participated. I think it's one of the largest voluntary force for the UN peacekeeping mission. And in this context, if you could talk about the Sri Lankan civil war that was going on, where the 57 Mountain Division, if I'm not wrong, played a very significant role.
There were three divisions. There was 57 Mountain Division, and then there was the 54 Division from Chakraborty. Yeah, 54 Division. One of those. No, let me just tell you how. There were three divisions. One was 4 Division. One was 57 Division. There was another. There was 36 div in Trincomalee, and of course there was the Jaffna Division. So that was the largest peace enforcement mission that India's armed forces engaged in. Yeah.
If you also look at the Operation Cactus and the transportation of the Indian paratroopers to Mali, you have written a very interesting story in the book as well. If you could tell us about that.
Cactus, which was launched in response to an SOS from President Gayoom, who was facing a coup, was the first really major joint operation that the Indian Armed Forces have conducted overseas. Major one. Of course, Sri Lanka was another one, was a joint operation, and while this was going on, was a real successful one. So a decision was taken in Delhi that the para brigade will actually be flown into Mali, and luckily for the parachute brigade, the opposition didn't really comprise of the military, but just a band of coup plotters and a couple of hijackers, and so we were able to surprise them. But it was a case of good planning in which the Air Force reacted swiftly, the para brigade reacted swiftly, and before the hijackers and the coup plotters knew that the Indian Air Force landed, 6 para and the other unit in Male, and they foiled the coup. So it was a case of good speed, flexibility, and planning.
Now, if I could ask you, if you could tell us a little bit about the operation in Siachen that took the Pakistanis by surprise, and that operation become a symbol of pride and nationalism for the years to come.
To understand Siachen, one has to go a few years before that, wherein there were a group of mountaineer soldiers within the Indian Army who were keeping close track of that region. And the moment they found that that region attracted the attention of the Pakistanis, they impressed upon Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and the Indian Army leadership that, look, we need to preempt the Pakistanis, otherwise they will end up occupying the Saltoro Ridge, and it will be a fairly risky proposition thereafter to try and dislodge them from those heights. And I think there was a lot of initiative, and there was a lot of delegation of responsibility that allowed the Indian Army to preempt the Pakistanis and occupy the Saltoro Ridge. In fact, at the same time as the Indian Army was planning their operations in March and April of 1984, the Pakistani force had already set course for a similar objective. But the Indians beat them to it by 2 weeks. But since then, the occupation of the Saltoro Ridge and the Siachen Glacier have had several strategic benefits, but it has also come at a very, very heavy cost. Several commanders who have commanded brigades in Siachen have in turn expressed the necessity and the urgency of seeing how best one can get Pakistan to the negotiating table to ensure that the entire Siachen Glacier area is demilitarized, but on India's terms and conditions, so that the effort put in by the Indian Army to occupy that area doesn't go waste unless it is traded for tangible strategic gains.
If you also look at how the army has evolved and specialized in largely terrain of operation through the period of 1980s, it's remarkable. First, it was the Operation Mintooth, then it was the Operation Blue Star in a complete different terrain from Operation Mintooth. And then they had to operate in a foreign land in Sri Lanka.
1980s, yeah, If I were to pick a decade in which the Indian Army engaged in different kinds of combat, I would pick the 1980s. And I don't think any other decade so far has seen so much of varied fighting. And I think the coming of age of particularly the Indian Army can be traced back to the 1980s. You're absolutely right. I mean, the 1980s started off with tackling urban terrorism in Operation Blue Star. It was just preceded by the Siachen operations. Then you had ongoing counterinsurgency operations in the northeast, in Nagaland. You had counterinsurgency operations in Sri Lanka of a different kind. You had an out of area contingency in Male during Operation Cactus. And at the same time, India's assertive army chief decided that he's going to carry out different kinds of operations simultaneously. You had Operation Brass Tacks in the plains. You had an operation going on in Arunachal Pradesh, Operation Falcon. So I think the 80s offered tremendous learning value for the Indian Armed Forces, particularly the Indian Army. And I think the 80s culminated in the commencement of the proxy war in Jammu and Kashmir, wherein General Zia-ul Haq's strategy of bleeding India with 1,000 cuts was converted into an operational strategy, wherein Pakistan refined and perfected the art of using covert operators and terrorism as an instrument of state policy. So the 1980s, I think, were the years of learning for India's armed forces.
You've also mentioned that in the initial stages, it's the non-state actor that gets the initial advantage. Whether we take the example of the insurgency movement in Punjab, Northeast, or even in Jammu and Kashmir, where the armed forces have been able to move swiftly and take action. We have also seen that the army has evolved a lot in areas like jungle warfare and even have a specialized counterterrorism force right now, the Rashtriya Rifles, which carry out such operations, and the success rate is nearly 100%.
While I would largely agree with you that the Indian Army, along with the Indian Air Force, have steadily improved their ability to fight in subconventional operations. All these operations that you have talked about, they all can be clubbed under one entity, and that is, the Indian doctrinal language that is used is subconventional operations. So subconventional operations have occupied much of our mind space since the 1980s. Now, you talked about the Rashtriya Rifles as a counter-terrorism force. The Rashtriya Rifles is not typically a counter-terrorism force. It was actually raised to be a counter-insurgency force. But over a period of time, you're absolutely right, they have also been literally, it is a question of circumstances forcing you to upgrade your skills to also include counterterrorism. So when you talk about semi-urban, or if you talk about terrorism in Jammu and Kashmir, yes, Rashtriya Rifles is a combination of a counter-insurgency and a counter-terrorism force. Yeah. Whereas rest of the army units in Jammu and Kashmir are involved in what is called counter-infiltration operations, which are because they are along the border. Rashtriya Rifles is located inside. They are located as the second layer of forces within Jammu and Kashmir for precisely the purpose that you referred to.
It is also commendable to see how the Rashtriya Rifles have carried out operations in the valley, operating in densely populated civilian areas and yet making sure that there's limited to zero damage.
The Indian Army fights particularly in Jammu and Kashmir and within our own, within the confines of our geographical frontiers, with one hand tied behind its back. It is the Indian Army is one of the most restrained and responsible counterinsurgency force, because unlike say the Americans or the coalition forces, they don't conduct counterinsurgency operations inside their own countries. They conduct it outside. Here the Indian Army is doing within. It involves Indian people, so there has to be tremendous amount of restraint. Even though we have excellent air power capability, we don't use the heavy hand of air power while dealing with insurgents and urban operations.
If you look from the turbulent period of 1980s and 90s, would you call it a success story in those areas?
I would certainly say the 90s and the first, the 90s and well into the current, the previous decade and even parts of this decade, I think Jammu and Kashmir did not seem to be stabilizing. The Northeast did not seem to be stabilizing. But over the last 3 or 4 years, even 5 years, after a series of ups and downs in Jammu and Kashmir, the agitation, the stone throwing, I think now there is some light at the end of the tunnel. There is a silver, they say behind every dark cloud, there is a silver lining. So I think there is a silver lining that is there both in Jammu and Kashmir and the Northeast. But do remember, a silver lining does not imply that it is going to be dawn. There is still a fair distance to go before one can say dawn has broken in both these places. There's tremendous amount of, there are possibilities, and now let's see how the next couple of years pan out, both in Nagaland as well as in Jammu and Kashmir.
The Indian Air Force has also evolved a lot over the last few decades, and currently it's the fourth largest in the world. How can Indian Air Force be used as a tool along the line of control if there's an escalation in the future? We have seen that the Air Force was deployed this time, but it was not used. So,
see, let me say that from an Indian context in recent years has been also used as a tool of coercion, as an instrument of coercion. Okay, and so I think air power will be of use along the line of actual control as an instrument of coercion. And should there be a limited conflict along the line of actual control with China, I think air power will be the first responder. And it will play a very, very critical role, unlike earlier, when there has always been a hesitation to even deploy air power along the line of actual control. So that's the big difference this time, that the Indian Air Force was permitted to deploy in large numbers in eastern Ladakh. There was a lot of flying. Air Force pilots have gained a lot of confidence flying in that kind of terrain. It has offered the people and the government fair amount of confidence that, look, we can also call upon the Indian Air Force to offer decisive capabilities in case of a limited conflict at high altitude with China along the line of actual control. So it's now a threat in being, not just coercion.
The Indian Air Force has also played an important role in various covert operations, and we have seen its role in the Balakot airstrikes by an array of 12 Mirage 2000 fighter jets. Uh,
Any kind of special operations, any kind of coercive action that needs to be done deep inside or inside enemy territory, or in areas that cannot be reached by the special forces, it is air power that will do the needful. And for that matter, don't forget naval power also. The Indian Navy has significant capability to carry out stealthy operations, and the Indian Navy has grown in size and strength and capability. And as India's influence and aspirations extend seawards, maritime power and the Indian Navy is going to play an increasingly important role in the coming years. And that is why we have Prime Minister Modi, who talks about Sagar, the Sagar initiative across areas of maritime influence. You keep hearing about the Quad, keep hearing about how the Indian Navy is preparing to match the Chinese Navy's capability as it challenges Indian dominance of the Indian Ocean. Yeah, don't forget the Navy when it comes to its ability to expand Indian influence.
Absolutely. In fact, looking at the aggressive Chinese behavior in the South China Sea, the Indian Navy has to be prepared for any action in the Indian Ocean region.
The thing is that the Indian Navy is very, very strong in the Indian Ocean region. And whenever I talk to senior naval officers, they say that, look, we will not bite off more than we can chew. So really, the Indian Navy is not interested or is not overly concerned, other than being concerned about what's happening, other than being concerned about Chinese coercion against India's strategic partners, towards India's friends like Vietnam, or for that matter, particularly Vietnam. But we have really no intention of attempting to interfere in the maritime domain to the east of the Malacca Straits. Okay. Our area of interest is to the west of the Malacca Straits, north and northwest of the Malacca Straits, and the Indian Ocean region.
Okay, so let me change the subject a little bit and ask you, do you think the nature of war will change in the coming years, and will it be more geography specific like we have seen in Kargil or the recent skirmishes in the Galwan Valley?
The term that one uses is limited conflict. So the kind of conflict that we are likely to face in the years ahead is limited. Limited in terms of geographical space, limited in terms of time, because no country today can afford to engage in a long period, particularly countries like India and China cannot afford to, or for that matter, Pakistan. And even the world's major superpower has really bled itself by sticking on in Afghanistan and Iraq for decades. We can't afford to do that we can't afford to invest that kind of effort and resources in prolonged conflict. So conflict in the future is likely to be short, it's likely to be swift, but it's likely to be of very high intensity. And therefore, in that short period of time, you need to be able to put in whatever combat power you have and cause the maximum amount of attrition on an adversary so that conflict can quickly de-escalate. So the future wars are going to be swift, short, technologically intensive, and will require and will not result in classical defeats or victories. They will always be linked to political outcomes and political objectives.
So do you think that armies need to cross border in the future to be actually in a war with a country? With the advent of digital war and information warfare, is it safe to say that you can be in a war without actually crossing any physical boundaries?
Yes, of course. That is exactly that's exactly the reason why whenever I talk about conflict, I talk about full spectrum conflict. And when you talk about full spectrum conflict, it also includes domains that you're just talking about right now. It includes cyber war, it includes space dominance, it includes information war. These are all included in the basket of threats that any country faces. And to prepare for it and to fight against it, fighting a war. And as far as crossing geographical boundaries on the ground is concerned, we have capability for that. If required, armed forces will do it. But the extent to which you can actually do it is completely limited. There's no way in which you can advance hundreds of miles like the Allies did during World War II or the Germans did. No. It will be primarily for effect, and it will be primarily notional. But that's about all when it comes to fighting for real estate. More than fighting for real estate, it will be fighting for dominance, for psychological advantage, for political advantage, for geopolitical advantage, for expansion of influence. Those are all the outcomes that one will look for in terms of short, high intensity conflicts. Yeah.
You believe it's time that researchers get unhindered access to certain classified information about wars that happened decades back, uh, and the information should be available in public domain so that policymakers can use it to shape future policies.
I think I would not go so far as to say that everybody should get unhindered access to classified documents about war and conflict. But I think through process of dialogue between practitioners and leaders of national security, academia, and researchers, one can work out a suitable time frame beyond which largely most documents can be declassified so that it facilitates researchers beyond people who have been on the inside to analyze and to make a value judgment as to whether it was right or wrong. That's why military history hasn't taken off in the kind of way it ought to have in India, because researchers don't have adequate access to archival material. And I think some strategy has to be put in place so that we can rectify that fault line that is there in our system.
I also don't think that there are any universities teaching military history as a subject.
Yeah, what has happened is that there are several universities that have departments of strategic studies. So, strategic studies is a khichdi of IR, political science, some amount of military history. And so that is why it's quite convenient to create departments of strategic studies because it's a hodgepodge, it's a mix. But if you create a focused department of military history, you need masala to get that department going, and you don't have that masala.
If I also could ask you a sudden reflective question of how your experience has been from the fast-paced life of a fighter pilot flying the MiG-21S and Mirage 2000 to taking out your laptop to adjust to the slow pace of life as a writer?
It's been a roller coaster ride. I mean to say, I was always interested in history. I always knew that I wanted to write history, but in my wildest of imaginations, I didn't realize that I would be that I had it in me to write these two books and that they would appeal to a wide cross section of readers, which is what I set out to be. So I think at the end of the day, I cannot but help feeling like a fighter pilot that I do feel a sense of mission accomplishment. So, fighter pilot habits die hard. So I will only say there is a sense of mission accomplishment when I look at the fact that I've been able to put together two big books on military history that is a one-stop shop for contemporary Indian military history.
We generally ask this to all our guests, and I will ask you as well if you could tell us 5 books that our young audience should read on military history.
You know, let's see. Let me start from the 1965 war, or should I start from 1947? Okay, when I start from 1947, uh, there aren't too many books written about the 1947 war. There is a good book written called Slender was the Thread by General L.P. Sen, who commanded 161 Brigade. Then there is a book by Chidanand Dasgupta about the political and the strategic dimension of the 1965 war, of the 1947 conflict. Then when you come to the 1965 war, there is an official history of the 1965 war that has been brought out by the government of India. That's a good book to read. You have War Dispatches by General Harbaksh Singh, which is also an excellent book. And then when you come to the 1971 war, you have a fair number of books that have been written about the Lightning Campaign. You have the autobiography of Air Chief Marshal P.C. Lal, which is called My Years with the Indian Air Force. You have, and I think, and of course, in all these campaigns, you have India's wars, a military history. So, and recently, Shiv Kunal Verma has written a very good book on the 1962 war. Prabal Das Gupta has written a very good book, Watershed 1967. So one can put together, if you're a military history enthusiast in India today, you can put together a decent collection of 20 to 25 books.
Well, that's a great news for military history readers, and of course, we have your books as well. The best part of your books, I believe, it's just not meant for experienced readers, but also for readers who are just starting out.
I've had a lot of feedback from all kinds of people. From there are professionals, business professionals, there are housewives, there are people who've wide cross section of readers. And the best, what I tell everybody is that don't be in a hurry to finish the book. You can easily read one chapter, or you can read one particular campaign and put the book away. And then when you feel like reading the next thing, pick it up again and read it. You don't need a thread from the previous chapters. So that's something that's been a plus for the book. Yeah.
Okay, let me just put it out there. Is it too soon to expect a book on Indian Air Power?
I don't know. I hope so. You see, I'd almost finished writing a book on air power in contemporary conflict because I did my PhD on that subject. So I do have a lot of material. It's just that I need to get over the writer's block now that I have, and get down to it maybe in a couple of years, because for the last 8 years I've been busy writing these two books, and it can be quite exhausting.
Thank you so much, sir, for taking your time and speaking to us. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you for having me over, and it was nice chatting with you on an issue which I think that a lot of your generation would benefit from increasing their awareness about India's armed forces and contemporary Indian military history. Well, ultimately, it's a choice of, you have such a wide choice of readings these days that that you just have to decide on what is it that you want to enhance your knowledge level. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, sir. And Jai Hind.